Good morning. Before we begin today, I just have a little bit of an announcement about my school. Some of you may have seen on a table down in the lobby area that we have some things set up on a table down there. Some of those materials I'll be explaining a little bit later this morning as part of what I'll be talking about today. But there is a stack of flyers on that table for a cultural exchange program at my school. It's going to begin in the year 2020, so next summer. And it's going to be for ages 8 to 13. And basically it will be a 1 to 2 week summer camp where children can come to our school in Hudson. They will stay with a family, and the focus of what they do there will be about American culture and experiences, and there'll be some science and technology related activities and weekend excursions. And I think we have some adults who want to come, so that's good. No age limit. So yeah, if you want to come spend a week or two with us in Hudson, feel free next summer, but there is some information on that here. There's a tuition cost, but the tuition provides all meals and lodging and all costs involved, except for the travel, I believe. So I just wanted to throw that out there. And 8 to 13. Yeah. However, if you or anybody that you know might have a child or an adolescent that is middle school aged that would like to experience an entire school year or all of middle school in Hudson, we also are able to provide that experience if you wanted to come. We're certified. We have a CBIS certification, which means that we meet all of the U.S. government's requirements for welcoming foreign students to our school. We have hosted a couple students from China for a school year. So if that's of interest to anybody here, you might know somebody who's interested in it, I would love to get your email address and we can get in touch and share some information. All right. As we begin today, on today's lectures, I do want to do a little bit of a review of where we were yesterday afternoon and just review some of the main points that were made, and then we will continue on right where we left off and learning about place-based education. So yesterday, we took a look at the role of place in the human psyche, and we talked about how it played a prominent role in the development of humanity in the human story. Even before the development of agriculture and writing, the role of place was so strongly emphasized in the activities that humans did that eventually led to the creation of civilization. So place has always played a prominent and significant role throughout history, in prehistory, in the ancient world, in the Middle Ages. Place has been a very important aspect of human life. We talked a little bit about the role of place in human development, talking about the sensorial explorers in the first plane, the imaginative explorers of the second plane, the social explorers of the third plane of development, and the role that place plays in each of those developmental phases of life, and how place just becomes, in that way, becomes integrated into our person because we experience place in such unique ways as we are developing into adult human beings. And we talked a little bit about defining place and how place is difficult to define. Took a look at the words of David Orr and Wendell Berry and how they struggle to define place, and by place they're talking about something more than just space. They're talking about that spirit of place, that thing that we don't have language for, that we don't have words for, and so it's very difficult to define, but we know that it's there. It's difficult to define, but we explored some ways that people in the past have gone about trying to give some structure to defining this thing that we can't really explain in words very easily. So we looked at how some people believe that place is a concept that we individually construct in our own minds, based on experiences that are personal to us, based on experiences that form our own identity, that it's that gives each of us individually a sense of that place that is so difficult to define. We also looked at how some people choose to believe that place is a concept that is socially constructed. It's something that it has to be created and experienced through some sort of collaborative or social experience with others, because so much of what we do as humans is based on our relationship with other people, our experiences with other people, and that has something to do with it. We looked at an architect's version of defining place as space plus character, and that word character being so wide open to whatever you want to put into it, basically. A very open definition that could be different for everybody, depending on how they want to define character. And then we took a look at Lawrence Buell's definition that, in a sense, combines all of those other definitions into just one clear and concise structure of place, something that combines physical materiality of space, individual experiences, and social experiences, and all of those things coming together to form this spirit of place that we don't have a word for. And that is where we left off. And where I'm going to pick up here this morning is Montessori and the concept of place. I just want to briefly take a look at some examples of what Maria Montessori has said in relation to this concept of place and how important it was to her. I know I've mentioned it already, but let's take a look at some more of her own words when she talks about place, and especially the importance of place in education and learning. In her very important work, The Absorbent Mind, she wrote, "The teacher's first duty is therefore to watch over the environment, and this takes precedence over all the rest. Its influence is indirect, but unless it is well done, there will be no effective and permanent results of any kind, physical, intellectual, or spiritual." That's really powerful when she says that a teacher's first duty is to watch over the environment, is to create a place that will respond to the students' developmental needs. And if a teacher does not do that, there will be no effective results of any kind. She believed strongly in the importance of place. It was key to her entire philosophy of education. In The Secret of Childhood, she wrote, "There is a striking relationship between the environment and the perfecting of a child's inner life." A striking relationship. This was something that she just observed. This was from observing children in the places that they were in multiple different countries, different cultures, different age groups, coming to the conclusion that she couldn't even really give a word for it, which is part of our problem here. We don't really have a language for this thing that we're trying to talk about. But she just observed that there is a striking relationship between the environment and the perfecting of a child's inner life. That is big. In Education and Peace, which if you haven't read it, I highly recommend this book, which is a series of lectures that she gave. But in there she says, we must not only offer children personal help, we must also provide them with the right environment. For their proper development depends on vital activity in and on the environment. Science has taught us that the aim of the new pedagogy must be to create the proper environment for development. She was an education reformer. She was trying to reform education, not by trying to fix little pieces of education that weren't working. She was trying to completely deconstruct and tear down the notion that everybody had of education at the time, which was based very largely on industrialization, and she was trying to rebuild something completely new. And when she did, she said the aim of this new pedagogy must be the environment, must be the place. That's the key to this new education. In the same work, she directly mentions adolescents. She said the supernatural, which is essentially another way of saying constructed, environment needed by the child and the adolescent must be created for them until they enter our adult social life themselves. It is up to us to construct such an environment to protect our offspring. That's her speaking of that mission again, giving that mission to educators. It's up to us to create the place in which our next generation can properly grow into moral, socially, culturally, spiritually aware people that can lead this world in a better direction. That's our mission. And the ideal environment for adolescents, as according to Dr. Montessori, as we've already pointed out, and as you know, she advocated for the idea of the farm as that perfectly prepared environment for the stage of life during that difficult transition from childhood to adulthood. The work of the farm, she said, is just ideal for perfecting that adolescent's inner life during these difficult years. But as we all also know, we don't all have a farm. We don't all have access to a farm in order to build a school on it. Most of us don't. So what about the rest of us? What do we do when it comes to constructing a place or providing these place-based experiences that will help to perfect the inner life of the child, that will help to spur on the development of our students in a positive and natural way? Those of us who are in villages, who are in suburbs, who are in big cities, what can we do? There's still hope, and this is where place-based education becomes so important and becomes so useful. To think of education in this way is incredibly helpful to educators like us who want to do something different and something better. And maybe we don't have access to a farm and the ideal locations that have been offered to us as the keys and the ideal places for students. Place-based education is a great way to provide the experiences and the places, even temporarily, for young people who will benefit from them. So I want to talk a little bit about the essential characteristics of place-based learning. These are characteristics of place-based learning that are so important for young people. For one, it is inherently interdisciplinary and enlightens us to the complex interconnectedness of all things. So when you're designing a place-based learning experience, this is something that you want to aim for too. You want to try to ensure that it has this type of characteristic, that it's interdisciplinary, that it speaks of how all things are interconnected. Just another quote from Maria Montessori. She said, "The observation of nature has not only a side that is philosophical and scientific, it has also a side of social experiences that leads on to the observations of civilization and the life of man." Even just going out into nature with the student can bring about all of these philosophical and scientific and social experiences that all come together in one place. That's what place offers us. Place-based learning emerges from particular attributes of a place. So when you're designing a place-based learning experience, you want to determine what are the attributes of this place where I am going to be working with my students. What are the attributes that are unique? What are the attributes that are important? What are the attributes that are going to help them understand this place as special and unique and a place that connects disciplines and connects us to nature and connects us to one another socially. Place-based learning tends to be inherently experiential. It's experience-based. This is key as well. If you're designing a place-based learning experience, that's not an experience where you're going to have students sit at a desk and read a textbook about a place. It's going to be an experience that requires them to do something in that place or with their knowledge of that place, to experience something new, not just read about it. Place-based learning is reflective of an educational philosophy that is far broader than learn to earn. What that means is that learn to earn philosophy is that sort of driving philosophy that is behind a lot of traditional education that says that we are preparing young people to get really great careers so that they can make a good living and be competitive in a global marketplace. I'm not saying that that's entirely bad or wrong. It's a reality of life that our young people need to get jobs when they become adults. Absolutely. But when that becomes the goal of education as opposed to life, as opposed to raising a new generation that is morally prepared for the careers that are going to be available for them, for the world that they are going to be leading, then that can be problematic. Place-based learning is about more than that philosophy. It's about perfecting the inner life of the child. So that's something to keep in mind. Place-based experiences, they tangibly connect the past and the present, self and community, and one's current place in the greater human story. And finally, one more essential characteristic of place-based learning, it creates the context for meaningful work and study, for experiential academic pursuits, for formative social interactions, manual labor, community service, economic endeavors. Place forges community. And especially when you're working with adolescents, That concept of community is so incredibly important. Their work as adolescents, especially early adolescents, their work at that age is social. It is social work. Anybody who works with adolescents knows that their minds are not even truly wired in early adolescence to really even take in a lot of academic information. It's difficult for them to focus, to concentrate, to memorize. It's difficult for them to do work that they cannot connect to their own lives at that age. And it's because their minds are so incredibly social. Their whole development is pushing them toward understanding society. And they need social experiences. And forging community is the way to help them do that in school programs. And place-based learning experiences truly do forge community. They are often collaborative. They are full of meaningful social interactions, working together, learning together, experiencing place together. I'm just going to change to a different PowerPoint now. All right. So with that, with those essential characteristics of place, knowing how important place is, how deeply embedded it is in the human psyche, how transformative it can be, what are some practical ways that we can go about developing, creating place-based learning experiences for students? That's what I want to talk about today. Just some actual practical ways that we can go about creating these experiences, designing these experiences for students. With this, I'll be giving some examples of things that we do in our program, or have done in our program. Some things, when Kelly and I were talking about our program yesterday, a lot of what we were talking about were place-based experiences and place-based learning in some form or another. But today I'll be pointing out some other things that we do there to hopefully provide you with a little bit of inspiration and understanding of how you can go about actually creating a lesson or creating a unit that is going to really focus on place and be experiential and have all of those essential characteristics that we just went through. Later on today, this afternoon, I'll set you up to start your independent project as well. And that's going to give you a chance to take some of these ideas, hopefully, and create something of your own that you would be able to take home with you to your schools or to your families. All right. So when it comes to frameworks for developing place-based learning experiences, there are three very common approaches that we can look at. Just three practical, common approaches to place-based education. There's disciplinary-based experiences that you can design. So that just simply means that it's an experience that is based in one particular discipline, like history or science, and that becomes the foundation for it, even though it ends up also exploring other disciplines and seeing how they're connected to one another. There is that approach. There's also the global-based approach and then the community-based approach. Now, each of these three approaches can be broken down into these 4 areas within each approach, and they can be studied or looked at in these 4 different areas and how they handle these areas. So there's, within each of these approaches is an objective, there is the question of the role of place, there is how knowledge is gained or the curriculum behind the experience, and then there are the values that it supports. So I'll go through each of these with you. And this is in your booklet, actually. I have In your book, it is a page like this that I've given you. It has this table on it. But I'll go over this with you. You can read along if you'd like and take notes on this sheet. But this breaks down each approach into these 4 areas. So for discipline-based learning, the objective is typically to incorporate geography into another disciplinary tradition such as science or history. That is a typical approach to it. I'll give some examples of this too after I go through these different areas here. The role of place in discipline-based learning, it tends to emphasize the specific discipline over any particular geographic place. Place enhances knowledge and experiences, but it does not necessarily define it. For knowledge acquisition, it is often heavy in first period lessons and second period research-based work, frequently complemented by readings of scholarly text. And the values that it promotes are intellectual development through that knowledge acquisition. So disciplinary-based, place-based experiences tend to be more intellectual. They are based on place and understanding place, but are often accompanied with lessons, and they do focus on more of the intellectual development side of human development. When it comes to community-based, I'll do that one second. The objective is to nurture an understanding of and appreciation for the local community and all that a local community entails. And by local community, you could be talking about your school community, you could be talking about the city that you live in, you could be talking about another city that you are taking students to. But it's also meant to inspire stewardship and a sense of civic duty. The role of place in community-based learning is to emphasize an entire community in all its neighborhoods. Place is key to the experience, and learning is largely experiential. For knowledge acquisition, the learning is experiential. The community itself acts as a living textbook. Experiences can be somewhat curated, but are also unpredictable. The values it promotes are rooted in local community context. Civic participation and contributions to a community are emphasized. With global-based learning experiences, the objective is to empower and inspire students to respond to social, political, and environmental challenges. This emphasizes place as a theater of current issues and challenges. Place is secondary to the critical thinking and to taking action about these problems. So place and global-based learning acts almost as more of an inspiration to take action in the world. It's often a blend of knowledge transmission through lessons and readings, but also with experiential learning, getting outside of the classroom. The values it promotes, they are relative and subjective. It depends. It depends what global challenges are being addressed and what the viewpoint of the particular learner is. But environmentalism, social justice, and civil rights are typically emphasized in global-based learning experiences. These are 3 types of place-based learning experiences that are offered frequently in our program. I will say that the disciplinary-based experiences tends to be done more frequently because we're just always learning on either science or humanities and going through these projects. So disciplinary-based experiences are those experiences that we can find that even if it's just for a day, we can find something that incorporates place into what they are learning. So, for example, a couple of years ago, when we were studying the Industrial Revolution with that group of students, there was a day where we took them up to Cleveland, our nearest big city. We walked halfway across this huge bridge that goes over this large industrial area that's full of factories and workshops. And we had the students do a little bit of research before we went there so that they kind of understood what those factories and workshops did. But the point was for them to be in a space, in a place where smoke is coming out of smokestacks and you're seeing nothing but industry and train tracks and buildings, and you're smelling it and you're feeling it. And it was also the middle of winter and it was really cold and they were shivering and we didn't care because they needed to experience that place. And then we went into a nearby market that was full of international stalls, immigrants running food stands, cooking their own ethnic foods, and we had lunch there together. But just to focus a little bit on how the Industrial Revolution in the United States also brought a lot of people into the country and kind of turned the country into more of a, what we refer to as a melting pot of different cultures. But that's the type of experience that would be a disciplinary-based experience. We're studying the history of something, and then we find a way to bring place into it. And that tends to be very common. I'll give some other examples here as well. For the disciplinary approach, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because this might look familiar. Yesterday we were talking about what we do in science. This is our pond. When the students are doing water studies, they often go out in the pond that's right behind our school. They test the water. They use the place of our actual school, of their community, to enhance what they're learning about so that they're not just reading about the properties of water in a textbook and doing some experiments in labs in a classroom, but they're actually getting outside into nature and seeing how what they're learning is relevant in the natural world. So that's another example. The next example of a disciplinary approach is a couple of years ago when we studied U.S. immigration. The students and I was teaching humanities at this time, and the students and I decided to create a documentary film about immigration into the United States as part of their learning experience. It was a big project-based work. It took a long time and a lot of planning. So what we did is we divided the class up into historic research groups, and so the students were divided into 4 different groups that spanned different time periods of the history of America. And each of them focused specifically on researching that time period with their group and what immigration looked like, who was coming into the country, where were they going, why were they coming here, how were other people that were here already responding to that. And then when it came to the documentary, what each of these groups did is they each wrote the script and planned what their section of the documentary film would be like. And then all the students were divided into all of these different production roles for the film. So we had students who created a storyboard, and they used Post-it notes to figure out, okay, this is where we're going to interview this person, and this is where we're going to talk about this, and this is where we're going to show images of that. And they created this whole storyboard. There were other people who were specifically responsible for writing the screenplay, and what that ended up being was the script for a narrator who was constantly narrating the story from beginning to end in the documentary. There were people who were responsible for writing interview questions for people that we interviewed. There were tech and sound equipment managers, and they focused mostly on the sound, and then there was a team of visual tech people as well that handled the cameras. How we incorporated place into this is that we reached out to the local community of Hudson, of the city around us, for specialists and for people that we could talk to that would give us information and allow us to interview them. And we were able to learn a lot. We reached out to a local television station and asked if we could possibly use their equipment and even their studio, and they said, absolutely. And they allowed us to use their cameras, their microphones, their headphones. We went to the TV station multiple times to use their studio there. So the students were able to learn from those television professionals. They were able to learn from them and hear about their work in the community, which was really special. Another special part of this is that they found people in the community that they could interview about immigration. This is a picture of Paul. He was one of our camera guys. And he is filming an interview with the owner of a local, what used to be a Catholic church. It used to be the first Catholic church in our town. And he purchased it and turned it into a yoga center. But the church has historic significance in our town because it was built by Irish immigrants who came to work on the railroad in Hudson. And they had no Catholic church, and so they built one with their own hands. And it was this building right here. And so they went to this church, and they saw what the immigrants had built. And the new owner of this building, he really did a lot of research and wanted to understand the history of his place. And so he shared it with them. And they were able to hear about that in the space that they were in. Down here in the corner, we found a local university professor from Cleveland who specialized in immigration. And he came to the television studio and they interviewed him. And they were able to learn from this local member of the community his expertise about immigration. And it was a lot of work, but it was incredibly fun, and there was a lot of deep learning involved in this entire project. Because we were able to implement place into it for the students. Now, when it comes to a global approach to place-based learning, this is what it looks like at our school, typically. The global approach could be if you are able to take your students on a trip to a different place outside of your community. Whether it's in your country, but in a different part of your country, or in another country. You take them to a different place, and you create a place-based learning experience there. And usually it'll focus on some sort of environmental or social or civic challenge. But you take them there to do it. So when we go on our trips to New York, Washington, D.C., these out-of-state, sort of faraway trips for us, our students actually do a lot of the trip planning themselves. They will make as many phone calls as they can, send emails, plan details, occasionally choose where we go. The guides do decide some places because we want to curate some of those special places that they might not know about yet because they don't have the life experience. But they do choose some of the places that they go. They design historic walking tours that they'll lead for the rest of the class. Oftentimes, other people around us when we're on these trips end up joining our group and kind of hovering in the background because they want to hear what the students are saying. But our students plan a lot of the trip, and when we are there, they're the ones giving presentations on site. When we go to the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., our students go up to the building, and whoever researched the history of the Capitol building will teach the rest of the class. But they do it right there on the spot at the Capitol building, not in the classroom. And we'll have discussions about challenges in government and what these government structures represent for us. And what is happening in them right now. There's a whole lot happening in Washington, D.C. right now, I'm sure. Let's see. We're hoping, just as a future plan, I mentioned yesterday, one thing we're working on in our program is to get the students actually outside of our country, not just outside of the state of Ohio to these other cities, but we're working on planning a trip to Costa Rica for next year, where they will be staying in the rainforest for a certain amount of days, and they're going to help an organization out there, if this all works out, to actually do some of the testing and collecting a lot of the data that this organization collects to sort of monitor the health and well-being of the ecosystems of the rainforest. And so it'll be a unique, really interesting place-based experience. It's still in the works, but I'm excited about it. I'm excited to get the students out of the country for a truly global approach. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of conversation in that one about climate and environmental problems. And a lot of it will focus on how we can solve those problems moving forward. Another example of the global approach in our program is that we participate in the Montessori Model United Nations program. Has anybody heard of this or participated in it themselves at their school? Great. This is a great organization that helps schools incorporate global place-based learning experiences in their curriculum. So we do it as an optional program. It's an extracurricular optional program for students, but it's become so popular that most of our students choose to do this. But it's a really wonderful way to get students to research global problems and other countries. They have to represent another country at this conference, and they have to understand what that country believes about a particular global problem. And then they go to this conference. We go to the one in New York City, but they have them all around the world now. And they have to represent their country as United Nations delegates and debate and negotiate and talk to other students. In New York, there are about 2,000 other Montessori students from around the world. And it's really an enriching experience for them. And it gives them a global perspective that they won't otherwise develop at this age. So researching the place and coming to know another place is part of what makes that a global experience, but also the fact that they get to be at the United Nations building when they are having the culminating experience of the Model UN. There's something special about being in that General Assembly Hall where so many world leaders have stood and spoken. That is really enriching and special to them. So here's a very short clip of one of our students last year. Tamer, this young man, he was voted by his committee to actually approach the podium in the General Assembly room of the United Nations building and give a summary of what his committee
created an exceptional resolution for the disarmament of chemical weapons. Some of this resolution consisted of a summit to discuss the tracking and disposal of these weapons, and each member state is to publish that the amounts of weapons and what their progress is in destroying these commodities, and to allow a member state in conflict to use these weapons for offensive and defensive tactics. I would like to welcome the delegation of the Republic of Austria, who will be talking about the consensus and the co-sponsors of our resolution. Thank you.
And that doesn't necessarily need translated, so don't worry about that video. But because what he's saying, he's talking about what his committee came up with in terms of getting rid of chemical weapons in the world. And he's giving a summary of it. But what he's saying is not really my point here. It's where he's standing as he's saying it. I was crying seeing him there in that place. And just having that experience for a young person like that, to be in that place and to understand that the importance of that place and to speak is so powerful. Sometimes that's what global place-based learning experiences can offer. Now I'll give this example of a community-based approach to place-based learning. And this I'll go into a little bit more detail about because this is something that we do in our program called Hudson Studies. And it's really become a staple of our program. It's become a very important part of what our students experience once as they go through the middle school. We do it once every 2 years, and so every student experiences Hudson Studies. And it's our community-based approach to place-based learning. So I'll walk you through what this is and how we do this, and then I'll also let you know that on the table down in the lobby, I have brought some materials from Hudson Studies, some student materials, and just examples of some project work that they have done. Some of their project work is too big for me to bring on a plane, but I did grab a few things that I could put into a bag that you could look at. And if any of you ever come to Hershey for training in the summer, and I've heard a couple of you at least are, or if you have been there, this is one of the things you have an option of doing while you're in an adolescent training. You'll come to our school and actually participate in a miniature version of Hudson Studies. We actually go into town in the afternoon, and you get a sense of what the students experience over the course of many weeks. But Hudson Studies is a multi-week experience. How many weeks we offer it just depends on the schedule for that year, because every year is a little bit different in how we can schedule everything in that we want to do. But typically it's around 5 or 6 weeks long that we spend with this. It is completely interdisciplinary. It results in student project work that spans humanities, science, math, language. It all comes together. And it is entirely experiential for the student. We're lucky to live in a little town that has a pretty rich history and a lot for the students to really focus on and learn about a lot of things that can pique their interest about the community. But I really believe that just about every community, every village, every town, every city has something about it that can be used to inspire student learning. It has people in it who will be able to capture their imagination through their stories and the stories of their lives. It has places that students could go that they will be able to connect with in some way. I truly believe every community has this quality. You just have to find it and find the right people, and you can prepare an experience like this. But our town has a very unique, interesting history. It was founded by David Hudson. I'll just give you a little bit of a background of what the students learn in that first period lesson that we give, which is an introduction to the whole thing. But David Hudson, in 1799, he traveled from the state of Connecticut, which is right here on the east coast of the United States, traveled straight over into northeast Ohio to start his own village. This was all wilderness, almost unexplored by Europeans who settled on the east coast at this point. But Connecticut drew these lines on a map and said, this is all our territory, straight west of our state. And he went through that territory to come out here into the wilderness to find a spot and plant his village. And he actually ended up going north into the lakes, the Great Lakes, and taking a boat. There's like a river that flows through here. He went around Niagara Falls, took a boat down Lake Erie, and then followed the Cuyahoga River on his boat, took that to a smaller creek, ended up in what is now Hudson. And he started this village. After he started it, it developed a really interesting history. A lot of just really fascinating things happened in this little town of Hudson. It was a part of what we call the Underground Railroad, which before the Civil War happened in the United States, the Underground Railroad, if you don't know, was a series of paths that slaves in the South could take to escape slavery to the North, which no longer had slavery. And many of them were trying to get to Canada, where they could live their lives and not be slaves. So it wasn't an actual railroad, it was a series of paths that they took to try to escape slavery. And Hudson ended up being a spot on the Underground Railroad. So slaves came through Hudson, and there are places in Hudson that we take students that were the hiding spots where families in Hudson would take slaves in and have secret hidden rooms in their homes or underground chambers where those slaves could hide from other people who were trying to find them, to catch them and take them back to the South. So that's a really interesting aspect of Hudson's history, that when you tell students that, it grabs their imagination. That is fascinating stuff. And it's information that reaches beyond Hudson too. They see how Hudson connects to the greater human story of American history and of world history and of human migration at that point. We have a lot of interesting characters besides David Hudson himself. Speaking of the Underground Railroad, John Brown was a character, a famous figure in the United States who grew up in Hudson. He was an abolitionist, which means he was a person who believed in getting rid of slavery completely. And I think you can, even in his photos, I think you can kind of see in his eyes, he was a very fierce, fiery person. He preached against slavery. He was angry against slavery. He ended up going down to West Virginia, a state south of us, and ended up leading a revolt where he got slaves together. He raided an armory, which is a place where the U.S. military stored their weapons, raided it, gave the weapons to slaves, and tried to start a revolt, a violent revolt against slavery, and ended up getting killed himself at that point. So it's not a story that necessarily ends well, but it's characters like this that grab their imagination, that pull them in, that help them to understand that their place where they live and where they work and go to school, it has a story. James and Lincoln Ellsworth. At one point in Hudson's history, during the Great Depression in particular, much of the downtown part of the city burnt down. A fire started in a local tavern, and a large part of the city burned to the ground, and the city went into economic despair, and all of the banks left the city. It was on the verge of just not even being a city anymore. James Ellsworth was a guy who grew up in Hudson, and he ended up becoming rich in the coal industry in America. So he moved away for a while, but he heard about what was happening in Hudson, and he came back, and he himself personally financed the reconstruction of the town. And he opened up the college that had been built there by David Hudson, which was considered like a Yale University of the West. They called it the Yale of the West. It had closed down. He reopened it back up and saved the city. And he had a son, Lincoln Ellsworth, that became an explorer, and he became one of the first. I'm assuming that that's okay. Thank you. Okay. I'm reading your reaction and seeing that there's nothing to be alarmed at. But anyway, Lincoln Ellsworth, another interesting figure that students really connect with. The son of James, he was one of the first explorers to fly over the North and South Pole, constantly exploring. He would have been much more famous, but at the time that he was doing it, our government tried to keep it a secret because we didn't want other countries to know that we were traveling over these areas. And so a lot of what he was doing was secretive, but he was a very great explorer. And all of these stories have roots in Hudson, Ohio, and students really latch onto that, and they realize that this place that I live in and that I learn in, it has a story, and I have to learn it because I'm a part of the story. What is my part going to be in this story? What am I going to do? What are students of the future going to talk about when my picture pops up on the screen? What are they going to say? This is just a little image of downtown Hudson, but the clock tower, James Ellsworth, that's one thing that he did when he came to save the town. He built that clock tower to be the sort of central focal point of the city, something that people could gather around for community events, and it's something that Hudson is very proud of. So we introduce all of this to students during this community-based approach to place-based learning, and then they embark on a series of activities over the course of many weeks. So what I just talked about was basically a first period lesson that they get. I don't know, maybe not all of you are familiar with the 3-period lesson format that Dr. Montessori spoke about, but the first period tends to be where the teacher imparts knowledge in some way to build a foundation of knowledge on which students can then further build their knowledge. Oftentimes the first period is experiential in some way to really pique their interest, but it's meant to inspire and provide a foundation. The second period in 3-period lessons is all about the students' work and what they do to learn. Not what the teacher does, but what the students do. Second period work. And that is a time when the teacher observes and guides. And then the third period of a 3-period lesson is how the students share their work with one another. That's when the student becomes the teacher. So a 3-period lesson starts with the teacher teaching, then the student learns in the second period, and then the student becomes the teacher in the third period. So in the second period of Hudson Studies work, the students will create a timeline of Hudson itself. They often start with this after getting the first period lesson. They'll create a timeline of Hudson, and this is something that is usually very large. We use big poster boards, and it'll be 30 feet long by the time we're done with it. But they go through the entire history of Hudson, and they look up, we have reading materials for them. They find all of the major events that took place in the town, and they get it all on the timeline, and they illustrate it with pictures, drawings. They make it beautiful, because we end up displaying it during the third period. But that gives them a sense of the history of the town, and also helps them to really start to figure out what they might be interested in exploring further. So they start with that, and then we take a trip into downtown Hudson that they plan. And even though it's only a couple miles down the road, so it's hardly worth calling it a trip, it does feel like a trip, because when we do this in Hudson, they don't go to the school at all. We have their parents drop them off in downtown Hudson and pick them up in downtown Hudson at the end of the day. So that they feel like they are in a different place and doing something different, and they're focusing on just that place. And typically it's about 4 days that we spend down there. Students plan the whole trip. What the guide will do is plan what theme each day is going to cover. So we'll have a day that will focus on maybe religion. We'll have a day that will focus on the economy. We'll have a day that will focus on government and city services. A day that focuses on the history of the town. And then the students will get into groups, and each group will be responsible for one of those days. And in that small group, they plan all of the details of their day. They make phone calls to people that we can go and meet and talk to and interview. They write the interview questions. They map out the walking directions from one place to another. They decide where we're going to eat lunch. They plan all of those details. And then we take the trip. And each day is responsible for leading everybody else on their day. And it's a wonderful experience. I have some pictures here. They give presentations. This is Aditi giving a presentation and to the other students in front of that Irish Catholic church I mentioned earlier. She's giving a presentation about the history of that church being built by Irish immigrants. and how it was moved from its original location to this location. It was actually picked up from its foundation and moved to a different place in order to save it from being torn down. And she's giving this presentation telling the story of the church, which also, interestingly enough, speaking of the Underground Railroad earlier, was a spot on the Underground Railroad. When you walk inside, you can see this square in the floorboards that used to be a secret door that could open up, and there was a crawl space underneath where slaves would go as they were trying to escape. So she's the one that's giving that lesson to everybody. Out there in the open, we have, when we're in Hudson, we often meet at this community center that's downtown that has a theater in it. This is an image of CJ. I don't know why that just happened. CJ. Leading the morning meeting. The students, when we go downtown, will even run the meetings for the day. They'll tell all the other students what's happening that day, what to expect. I guess that slide is just going to move on by itself. That's the computer telling me to speed up a little bit, maybe. This is the students they're meeting. Oh my goodness. They're meeting in a room at the Hudson Library, but they're talking to the city arborist. The arborist is the person in charge of keeping our trees healthy in the city, and he's telling them all about his work. I'm really sorry about these slides. I think there was a setting that I should have changed on here. But they're learning all about trees. This was a day when they were focusing on the environment of Hudson, and so they're learning from him. They go to the fire department and get to hear from our firefighters and see the equipment. They always love doing that because they like seeing the big trucks. Here they're at the police department, getting to sit in police cars and feel really cool about it. That's Tamer, he's the one that spoke at the United Nations. Here they're meeting with our mayor and city manager in our town hall, and they're talking about the work that they do for the city. You can see their heads are down a little bit. That's because they take notes through all of this. We always have them taking notes, and they also keep a journal where they, every day, they journal what they're experiencing, and they go home at night and they write what we call a travel log. I have some examples of travel logs on the table down there. But they'll write a narrative about each day of this trip, which helps them to just crystallize, solidify the information and the experiences that they're having. We go to local churches and religious institutions. When David Hudson started the town of Hudson, he had 3 things that he thought were the most important things in the development of a town. It was religion, education, and business. And so as soon as he got there, I'm going to stop this for a second. As soon as he got there, he established a church, he established a school, and he established a business. And it all took off from there. Here is Paul. He's giving a presentation in front of David Hudson's house, which also was a stop on the Underground Railroad. So every once in a while we get to go inside of the house. But up in the attic of the house, the 3rd floor, there was a wall and a secret space behind the wall, a secret door that led into the space behind it. Here they are in the local cemetery visiting the grave sites of the town's founders and all of the different founding families. That's always a sort of a solemn and quiet experience for them, but an interesting experience that they get to have after learning about these people who started and built their city. To be able to go and actually see their gravesite. They probably ride and walk past it almost every day, but before Hudson Studies never really knew the story behind it and the richness of this place that they get to go. Sometimes we'll stop when we get to a place like this. We'll stop and just ask the students to quietly write in their journal for 5 to 10 minutes to just reflect on the importance of the place that they are in. We'll go and talk to the town archivist who works in the library, but they go to the archives, which is a place where that essentially stores the history of our town, all of the documents and objects important to the history of Hudson, I get to do. I really apologize that this slideshow is acting so strange. Okay. We incorporate other disciplines into what they're doing. So this picture, they're at the clock tower downtown. I'll go back to it. And they're doing a math project, actually. They're trying to measure the height of the clock tower using nothing but the shadows that it's casting, and figuring out how to mathematically calculate the height of the tower. Here they are at one of the first observatories in the United States that was built in Hudson to look out into space. That's them doing the math project again, measuring the clock tower and measuring tape in their hands. They split up into teams and see who can come the closest to actually guessing the height of the tower based on its shadows. So after they visit the town and they learn about the story of Hudson through experience and through these experiential learning opportunities, they return from that and develop interdisciplinary projects. So what this means is that they figure out what they're most interested in based on what they experience, and then they develop a project around that. But the project has to touch on, it's not just about history. A part of it's about history, but they also have to come up with an idea that involves science and doing some sort of experiment related to their topic. They have to come up with a math aspect of their project, and they often have to come up with a creative. It depends how much time we have for this project, but there's often an artistic component as well. And then there's also a language component, and that is the fact that they will write a dramatic performance at the end of this. And so each of them will become a character related to their research topic. And they will write and tell the story of that character from that character's perspective, and they put on a big dramatic production at the end of all this, that we invite their parents and we invite the community to it, all the people that they meet, the mayor and city manager, firefighters. We invite everybody to the theater to see them act out the history of Hudson. But they write it and they produce it themselves, and that brings language into their project work. So some examples of project work that have been done. I have some pieces of projects down on the table down there, but Ileana Smith, she became interested in this family called the Oviats, and I think it was because that community center that we would meet at in the mornings when we were spending time in town, it was on a street called Oviat Street. And Ileana just became curious as to why streets are named what they're named, and she found out that it was named Oviat Street because there was a family called the Oviats who lived on that street, and they were prominent members of Hudson society in the early years of Hudson. And so she wanted to find out who this family was, what did they do, how did they get a street named after them. And so she went to the archives of Hudson, worked with the archivist, found documentation about this family, learned all kinds of great information about the story of this family. And one of the things that she did was she created a very short documentary about the Oviats, a video documentary where she actually impersonated different members of this family and did a little documentary about them. She also created a family tree. This is it laying on a table, but this is what it looked like when it was hanging up. She created a hanging family tree of the Oviats that showed their genealogy of the family, which was really interesting. So when she displayed her work, she had her laptop to show the documentary. She had her family tree hanging nearby. For science, she ended up developing a science project that tested different materials that would have been available at the time of the Oviats for making the clothes that they wore. And then she experimented with different ways that they might be able to dye those fabrics to make different colors. And she tried to figure out what did they use in Hudson at that time to dye the fabrics of their clothes. And she developed a whole science project out of it, and this is just an image of some of the different samples that she had. And she really tried to figure out what fruits could be used to create the best color, what fruits were even growing in Hudson at the time. She really went into a lot of depth. Just some other quick examples. Mia Iverson, she became interested when we were studying Hudson studies. She became interested at who was living in Hudson before David Hudson got here, because there were people living in the area before the Europeans came in. And she wanted to know about the Native Americans who were in the area before that. And so she did an in-depth study. She created a beautiful sort of photo book of pictures and illustrations, and then she would write captions and information, and really went into depth. She really got into this topic. She found a lot of interest in it. Studied the Shawnee, some of the battles that they had with Europeans that who were trying to settle here. All of it results in that dramatic production. We use lights and we use sound in the whole 9 yards. We go to a local theater to do this. So it really makes the students feel special and that they're making something really big, especially when the community members come in, the people that they interviewed in town come and see them. It makes it a very special third period moment for them to be a part of. We're with you before you begin doing some more independent type of work on your own so that you can have your own experiential learning opportunity. So I laid out for you here this morning those 3 common types, or 3 common approaches to place-based education: the disciplinary approach, the community approach, and the global approach. Now I want to talk a little bit about how you can frame studies of place for adolescents within each of those approaches. There are a variety of things you can do that can help to give a study of place some structure to students, because that's just a practical, necessary thing to do, because places, as you can see, are so rich with so many diverse opportunities. It helps to give some structure to it. So there are a variety of ways to go about this. I'm going to share with you some of the ways that I go about it for different experiences. One of those ways is to allow students to look at the characteristics of a village or a city, just these major 5 characteristics. So this is definitely a good framework if you are studying a village or a city or a suburban area, to look at these 5 major areas. And I have this on page 22 in your handbook. What this looks like, I've used this before when studying, even when studying ancient cities with students, I've used this type of framework. But a lot of what I do with Hudson studies is based on this as well. And each of these 5 different areas of a city are broken down into guiding questions, which you'll see on that page in your booklet. Now, I'm not going to just go through each of these questions. You can look at those on your own, but just to give you some idea of what these guiding questions are like. All cities and all villages, they have physical characteristics. And so posing questions to the students about this can be very helpful. So when and why was a community established in this location? Getting them to understand why a particular community decided or why it was rooted in one specific geographic location can be a way to get them to explore that aspect of the physical characteristic of a place. And how did it acquire its name? Even things like what architectural styles are predominant and why are they predominant in this place? These are all physical characteristics. There are also social characteristics in any city or village in which you live and go to school. When has the community grown in population or declined? What were the causes? How has the community regarded the outside world? How has it responded to outsiders? Do people of different economic means live in different areas of the community? What are the differences in their living standards and values? These are all interesting and relevant questions that can be posed to students that can get them thinking about these different aspects. There are also economic characteristics in any society. What has been the basis of the local economy? How and why has this changed over time? Our students tend to connect a lot with the economic characteristics when they study Hudson, especially because they do spend a good part of a day going around and visiting business owners and interviewing business owners, talking to local business people. And they connect with it because they themselves run a business at the school. And so they feel like they have experience they can actually talk about. And they feel like they actually have real questions that they can ask about how commerce works in the real world. And they always have such great questions for business owners. It blows me away, but it's because they actually run a business. And they often connect with this aspect of learning about a place. They're really interested in the economy. Law and government is also another aspect of any city that students can explore. So understanding how the community establishes and enforces its laws and standards. How does illegal activity compare with national norms? How is public safety handled? These are all questions that can get students thinking about that aspect of a place. And then the environmental setting. What is the main source of energy? What is the main source of water? Getting students to actually think about where their energy and water comes from is a fascinating thing too. They don't think about those things. We talked about that a little bit yesterday, and how in this increasingly globalized and digital world, place is becoming so abstract that young people are having a difficult time truly understanding what it is and truly even thinking about where anything around them came from and who else's hands was involved in the making of these things and providing them with these things. So having guiding questions like this, even that help them to explore outside of themselves, to explore these types of ideas, to understand that we live in a globalized society, but it's because we're so interconnected as human beings anyway, but to appreciate, not just know that we're a globalized society, but to appreciate that we are a globalized society, to appreciate where everything comes from that they are blessed with, I believe is important for young people. And to get them there, we can't just tell them that. So sometimes it helps to give them questions and have them answer the questions on their own and come to those conclusions and realizations themselves. So that's what this approach does, works with those guiding questions. Another framework that I use for place-based learning experiences are using the fundamental needs and tendencies of humans, which Dr. Montessori talked about a little bit, but her son Mario especially got into this topic of fundamental needs of humans. These are basic things that all humans, regardless of where we are from, regardless of socioeconomic class, regardless of religion or gender, these are things that we all share. These are things that we all need. And our actions tend to be dictated by these needs until those needs are fulfilled. So there are material needs and there are spiritual needs. And I'll give a lesson on this to students, even though most of them learn about this coming up through elementary in a Montessori school. We do a review in middle school and have a little bit of a deeper discussion about it at the adolescent level. And then oftentimes I will use this as a basis to inspire them to study an ancient city based on how the people of that city fulfilled their fundamental needs and tendencies. I also use this in Hudson studies, and we have discussions about how the people of Hudson, how their needs are fulfilled, how they pursue their tendencies. So it's a good framework. The material needs, food, water, shelter, clothing, defense, these span time and space. as important to human beings, so they can be used to study any place and how humans exist in that place. Spiritual needs, vanity, culture, and then spirituality or religion. The term spiritual here referring not so much to a specific religion, but to our need as human beings to feel connected to each other, and even to feel connected to something that is greater than ourselves. Whether you believe that as a deity, a god, or just this concept of love, relationships. It can be even just feeling a mission in life, that you want to contribute to humanity in a positive way. Humans have this need of just wanting to feel connected to something other than themselves. And that's what spirituality is really referring to. When we talk about spiritual needs, the word vanity in English, vanity is a word that has gotten sort of a negative connotation to it. It tends to mean that you are proud and conceited. But when Mario Montessori talked about vanity, he was referring more to the need that humans have to appreciate themselves and to love themselves and to take care of themselves. That is a real need. So we talk about this with students, and we'll explore how different places help people to fulfill these particular needs. The human tendencies as framework, tendencies are drives that humans have that become particularly strong when all of our needs are being fulfilled. They are drives that we tend to feel, that propel us toward different types of activities. So humans have a tendency to want to explore what is around them. We have a tendency to communicate. We have a tendency to try to create order in things. One example of that is what's happening right now. We're talking about frameworks. We're trying to create some sort of order around this abstract idea of using place, which we can't even really define adequately as a learning experience. We're trying to give it order right now. That's a human tendency. Belonging. Work is a human tendency. It's very rare that a person is just going to sit down and stare at a wall. There's usually some activity that we are propelled toward, and it might be work or it might be some sort of leisurely activity, but work and activity are tendencies. Orientation is another tendency, and that is our tendency to want to orient ourselves to any space or situation that we are in. A very simple example of this that I think about whenever I talk to students about these ideas, when I talk to them about orientation, I point out how, do you ever notice when you walk into a room that you have never been in before, or a building that you've never been in before, do you ever notice that you automatically want to look around? You want to know where things are. Where are the doors? Where are the windows? Where's the bathroom? Where am I supposed to go? What is the flow of this place? That's a simple version of orientation. We like to orient ourselves to our environment. Manipulation is a term that refers to our tendency to want to actually manipulate the natural world around us. This can be something as simple as setting some clay in front of a child and watching them grab it and start to turn it into something as big as an ancient society creating millions of clay bricks and building a temple. Humans have a tendency to want to manipulate the earth and to create, and they use imagination in order to do that. We have the ability and the tendency to want to imagine what we do not see. And abstraction is a really difficult one to define, but there is this tendency in humans to want to almost embrace abstract ideas. I think that's why we're attracted to poetry and to art. We enjoy the fact that we can understand that one thing can symbolize another thing, and that we can get that idea. It's difficult to explain. We've been talking about the definition of place a little bit here, and the definition of a place that has the spirit of place. Genius loci, that's what the Romans call it. How difficult that is to explain, but at the same time, do you kind of enjoy the fact that we can still talk about it and still understand it even though we can't seem to give language to it? That's abstract. And we have a tendency to do that. We have a tendency to understand things in that way, in an abstract way. But the human tendencies are another way that you can inspire students to explore a place and how humans experience that place. This is another one. This historical and social science concepts, this actually is a framework that comes from the National Trust for Historic Places in the United States, and I actually find this helpful, especially for specific sites or specific buildings, not so much entire cities or villages, but if you're taking students just to one specific monument or memorial or a park, this can be a helpful framework. This is actually created by the National Trust for Historic Places for tour guides to develop effective tours, to teach tourists and people who come into places about that place, and to try to help them understand the meaning and the story behind it. And so that's why it can be a helpful framework for specific places, just a way to think about developing a lesson or having students research a particular place. But there are spatial relationships of any place, and that helps students to define a place itself. It helps us to define it in relation to other buildings and structures and to the natural environment. So just simply looking at its spatial relationships to other things. Temporal relationships. These help the student define a place in terms of its chronology and the chronology of the environment in which it exists. The interaction between humans and the natural environment is another important one. Defining a place in terms of the natural environment in which it came into existence. Design. This is one I like, having come from a background in art history, and also having dabbled in architecture before that. I love talking about design and aesthetics and style, the next one after, and what those say about a particular place. Because there's usually a reason that a certain style emerges. There are usually messages behind certain shapes and colors and lines, and people who design make their decisions on purpose, and finding out the reason for that purpose can be very enlightening. And so helping students to understand that can add some depth to what they are learning, and that plays into the aesthetics and style as well. The use of space. Design is used to order space and imprints the human intent on the environment. So yesterday we took a look at the Gothic cathedrals of Europe a little bit. If you remember those big churches, and I was talking at how they are designed specifically to motivate a person to move through the spaces of those churches in a very specific way. That's what this is talking about. Is the use of space designed in a particular way to actually attempt to dictate your movement through the space? That's something to look at. The building materials and the techniques used to build. This shows the interaction between new technologies and available materials. It ties together with aesthetics, the use of space, and values, creates dramatic influence on the design of a place. Form and function, the form of any built environment, how the place will look is connected to function, what a place is used for. So finding clues about form and function. And context. A place is rarely experienced in isolation, but rather in relationship to all the elements in the natural environment and built environment surrounding it. And artifacts. People produce objects for specific purposes. So in a place, what are the artifacts in that place? What are the objects used in that place? Those often have a relationship with the place itself. An empathetic understanding is a really interesting one that the National Trust for Historic Preservation uses. This occurs when students experience themselves as personally and emotionally connected to what they have learned intellectually. So an example of this might be from yesterday when we looked at, I showed you the picture of my students at the 9/11 Memorial in New York City, for example, and how the design of that space brought them to a hushed silence. That's them connecting on an emotional level, and it's enhancing their intellectual learning about that event and its effects. So trying to find how our students can connect emotionally to a place is actually really important, especially for adolescents. They have a difficult time just because of the way that their brain is developing. They have a difficult time thinking outside of themselves in a lot of ways. And so they understand information better when they can relate what they are learning to their own lives. And that's this empathetic connection that you wanted to help them make. What does this mean to me? How does it affect me? How does this connect with my story? If it doesn't connect with my story, for the adolescent, might not be very important to them at this age. So help them make that connection. And that's one thing that place-based education is so terrific at doing, is making that connection. It's harder to make that connection when you're sitting in a classroom and looking at a textbook. All right, another piece of this is also useful, just like that last one. This is also useful for visiting specific sites, monuments, memorials, whatever it may be. This is also in your booklet, just as something you could use. Something we use on occasion when we go out to a specific place and want to learn a little bit more about it. And it's really just a way of helping students to ask their own questions and come to some of their own conclusions. So they can explore a site, a particular place, or even an artifact. This even works in an art museum or some sort of other history museum if they're looking at artifacts. It allows them to just organize their thoughts around what kind of evidence is this? And what inferences, what can you draw from it? What can you guess that this might mean? What does this tell you? This is a framework that helps students to develop their own guiding questions, to figure out what it is that they want to pursue, to try to make their own guesses. And you know what, in a lot of ways, when you let students do this is something that helps them to make that personal connection to what they're studying, because you're giving them the power to just be curious and to just organize that curiosity in such a way that they can go back and look over their curiosity and say, you know what, this seems to be something I am most interested in exploring on a deeper level. So that can be a helpful way to do this as well. And then, another framework that I use for place-based experiences is that Lawrence-Buell model that we talked about yesterday when we were discussing the definition of place. And his theory that place and that spirit of place that we're really trying to capture is something that happens when these three different things merge together. The physical materiality, the individual connections and experiences associated with that physical material space, along with the social meaning of the experiences in that space. When those come together, you have place. And so this is a framework that I will often refer to with students when they're studying a specific place, because it just breaks it down in these three areas. And this can be a good framework even for short experiences, or even just a discussion, to get students to talk about, well, what is the social meaning of this place? How can this be important in terms of the interactions between people? What are the individual bonds of this place? Describe the physical materiality to me. Tell me what the physical materiality does to influence individual and social experiences. This can be a good framework even for short discussions, just to get them thinking and get them interested in a particular place. And to explore. This is a model that I use actually on the very first day of school every year, when we come together as a brand new community to start the school year. We'll take a look as a community, we'll take a look together at this model of place, this framework of place, and this quote by poet and environmentalist Wendell Berry, which has kind of become, it's a quote that we have around our community. It's something we talk about every once in a while when the community needs to rally together around something. This quote that says, "A community is a mental and spiritual condition of knowing that a place is shared, and that the people who share the place define and limit the possibilities of each other's lives. It is knowledge that people have of each other, their concern for each other, their trust in each other, the freedom with which they come and go among themselves." It's a beautiful definition of community. And we try to really live that out in our adolescent community. But we'll discuss this on the first day. We'll discuss it and try to dissect it for what it really means and how we can apply it to our own community. And then we take a look at place. And we talk about this place that we share, in which we define and limit the possibilities of each other's lives. And so we talk about the different aspects of place. And one thing that we do on the first day of school, after we do this, first we talk about ethics, and the class creates their ethics together that they commit to really trying to abide by for the year. But then we really explore the physical materiality of our place, our campus, our school buildings. How can we as a community best use this place for these individual bonds and for social meaning, for social context? How can we best use this place for learning experiences together? And that leads to something called a site safari, which is something that I'm going to ask you to do here today before you choose a little bit of an independent project to work on. So on the first day of school, we talk about community, we talk about place, and then what the students do. We try to encourage them to really think about the place that they are in and the place that they are learning by going out and exploring it. We want them to develop a relationship with their place of learning, with their place of their community. So if you want to turn to page 27 of your booklet, I have there a copy of a sheet that our students get. And what we do as guides on that first day is we'll split the campus up into different site locations. And so there'll be we have a woodlot in the back of our school. We have a pond back there, which you've seen in some pictures. We have a pond in front of our middle school, a very small pond up there. We have our gardens. We have all kinds of different spaces on our campus. And so we break up those different site locations, and the students will be randomly picked to go to one of those different site locations. And they take this sheet with them. And they're asked these questions. And they have to do this completely silently. They're not allowed to talk, because we just want them to absorb whatever environment they are in. So we ask them, take in the area around you, and what do you observe? What do you hear? What do you smell? How do you feel being in this place? We try to get them to experience their time and place in that moment through the senses, and to really focus on that. And they'll write down notes. Then we ask them, what is the natural setting? What was here before the work of humans? We always get a lot of interesting responses to this one. But we ask them to basically imagine what this area was like before humans came along and manipulated it and built upon it. What do you think was here? What do you think this place was like? What is the history, the natural history of this spot? What have humans done to use this setting for their welfare? So essentially we ask students to consider, how has this space been used since humans have come and started to manipulate the space to use it for something? What has been done to it? What have they chosen to do to make it more suitable for their own welfare? What materials and technologies do you see or hear that were made by humans? Oftentimes when students reach this point, the guides will all just kind of quietly walk around the campus as students are doing this, and so we watch them. And at this point, we usually see them get to this question, and they'll look around for technologies, but they usually all just eventually close their eyes so that they don't see anything, and they just listen, which is a really cool thing for them to do. They just listen to see what they can hear in terms of human-made technology. And they're often surprised. We have a big highway about a mile down the road, and they never realize that they can constantly hear the trucks and the traffic of that highway when they're outside of our school. They never notice it until they close their eyes and really listen. And they can hear how that highway has affected the area. How do you think these human influences have changed the land and the wildlife for the positive and negative? So really getting them to think about how humans use space, how humans use a place that they come to. How do we use it for the good? How have we used it in a negative way? It's important for them to start thinking about that as adolescents. And then this last one is one that we spend a lot of time discussing when we get back together. What projects do you think could grow out of this place and setting? So we get them to actually just think about any learning opportunities that they could get out of that place that they have just observed and taken in through the senses. They have just sort of evaluated and analyzed the human impact on this little space of land. And now we ask them, what can we learn from this? And they come up with all kinds of ideas. Some of them are scientifically related, some are historically related. They come up with art project ideas. They want to write poetry by the pond. They want to do paintings back in the woods. They come up with all kinds of creative ideas, but what we do is we come together with them. Afterward, we go through all of these questions, have a nice discussion about it, and I think this is in your booklet as well, because it's a little bit hard to see on the screen, but we end up creating a document like this that we then give out to all the students. and we guides discuss, because we take the information they give us. We listen to what they want to learn. We listen to the ideas that they come up with, and we try to incorporate these ideas into the school year, into the curriculum, into place-based learning experiences right on our campus. So sometimes this dictates the occupations that we do. You may remember we talked about our bees. We have beehives. And we usually have a bee occupation each year where a group of students can do an occupation based on those bees. Those bees came about because of site safari. Some students realized we have the space and resources to get some bees. And that was one thing they wanted to do and learn how to do, and so we did it. So we really listen to what they want to do on the land, and we create place-based learning experiences and occupations. Sometimes our expressions classes that we have on Wednesdays, we'll get ideas for those from the site safari that they do. If they want to do poetry or painting or land art, sometimes they want to just find whatever materials and sticks and branches and rocks that they can find laying around and create sculptures out of them. We'll create a whole expression out of that. So this is a very meaningful thing that we do on the first day that helps our students to think about the importance of place in their learning. And it's also a reminder for the guides, quite honestly, of the importance of place as well, and how we need to focus on the place that we have as a community and what we can learn from it and what we can do to it with the students.